looking at the word that we want to focus on today, it is a word that means to teach, but it has an actual meaning or a concept of sounding down. That's where it comes from, the idea of sounding down. So thus resounding in the ears. So it is a teaching, but it's done through instruction or teaching by word of mouth. That's the focus of this particular word. Paul actually uses this word to call out those who are abusing the spiritual gift of speaking in tongues over in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 19. Yet in the church I would rather speak 5 words with my mind than that I may teach others than 10,000 words in a tongue. Now, of course, your word teach here is that I may orally instruct others with words. Now, I did actually cross out, you can see there on the screen, I did cross out the word understanding because this isn't your word for understanding. This is your word for mind, which is an interesting concept when we understand, because here he is speaking about, of course, the fact that he would rather speak 5 words using his own mind than a whole plethora of words speaking in a tongue that he doesn't understand. The issue is the person who actually had the spiritual gift of speaking in tongues does not comprehend what they're saying. So how can you properly instruct a person if you don't even know what you're actually saying? And this is what he's calling them out for. And you see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 14. For if I worship in a tongue, my spirit worships, but my mind is unfruitful. Now, again, there are times where they'll translate it pray or understanding in this passage. But remember, your word prayer has a lot of different meanings to it, so we need to understand what it actually means. And in this case, he's talking about worship, giving God credit for what he has done. Well, if I don't understand what I'm saying, how am I going to teach somebody? Since speaking in tongues was assigned to the unbelieving Jews, it is no longer an active gift in the church today. God is not focusing on the nation of Israel right now. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 22. Therefore, tongues are for a sign not to those who believe, but to unbelievers. But prophecy, of course, is not for the unbeliever, but it is for those who believe. So the sign of the tongues and the use of tongues was early on in the church to show Israel God is doing something different. But Israel rejected what God was doing. Now, therefore, tongues actually ceased. So now that God is not dealing with Israel as a nation, because the Gentiles are being brought into the blessings that relate to Christ, the gift of speaking in tongues actually caused itself to cease because the purpose for it stopped. So therefore, it's no longer needed. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 8, love never fails. But whether there is prophecy, they will be rendered ineffective. Whether there are tongues, they will cause themselves to cease, and whether there is knowledge, it will be rendered ineffective. And it does actually use here not with prophecies, they'll be rendered ineffective, not saying that God will not give prophecy in the future, but for the church, we have no need for prophecy. We already possess all of the prophecy. So there is no reason to have additional prophecy. And of course, because we possess all of the information, people who claim to be prophets today will bring extra biblical information, which is not actually appropriate for Christians to be involved with. We don't need prophecy. We have the whole thing. It's the same thing with the knowledge here. And what he's talking about is the gift of knowledge, how to function in the Christian life. Well, we possess all of that information now. So now it's a matter of using it. He's not talking knowledge, all knowledge. So the gift of tongues has actually ceased. It has no value in the church. However, even when it was active, it was never for the purpose of edification or enlightenment or anything related to the spiritual growth. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 4 talks about the fact that the one who spoke in a tongue edified himself. Well, the spiritual gifts that now reside, or remain, I should say, those are gifts for the edification of the church, not for the individual. And In the opening paragraph of the letter Luke wrote to Theophilus, and Theophilus, try to get that word out, Theophilus, it actually means a friend of God. He employs the concept of verbal instructions received. He writes to put in chronological order the things that Theophilus was orally taught. So Luke chapter 1 and verse 4. That you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed, where in this case your word instructed actually means you were orally taught these things. Apollos, a Jew from Alexandria, was orally taught in the way of the Lord. He was fervent in spirit and accurately taught the things of the Lord. His teaching, though, was only related to the immersion of the baptism of John. He still taught very accurately according to what was taught to him. Acts chapter 18, verse 25. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord, though he knew only the immersion of John. So he only knew about the coming of the forerunner. He didn't know the other information. He spoke boldly in the synagogues what he was taught. Aquila and Priscilla, who spent a long time with Paul, took Apollos aside and explained the way of God more accurately. Later, Apollos actually becomes the pastor of the church in Corinth, the Corinthian assembly, until, to be honest with you, he finally got fed up with their carnality and he left. And Paul even actually encouraged him to go back, and his response was like, well, maybe. He wasn't really, he didn't appreciate their carnality because they were constantly focusing on carnal things and not spiritual things. The Jews in Jerusalem have been orally taught about Paul's time among the Gentiles. These Jews orally taught the Jews in Jerusalem, so these would be the Jews from Asia, came in and they taught the Jews in Jerusalem that Paul was teaching that the Jews among the Gentiles should no longer circumcise their children, which Paul never taught that. He did teach that a Gentile should not be circumcised. Said circumcision, there's no value to it. Okay, Acts chapter 21 and verse 20, we see this. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord, and they said to him, you see, brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. So you see that they were very zealous for the law at this point. And then I actually should have dropped down one more verse on that. But in the context here, to correct this issue, because they had been taught that he actually was teaching that they should forsake the way of Moses. To correct this, some of the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem instructed Paul to take 4 men who were under a Nazirite vow and to pay their expenses so that they could actually shave their heads. This would be done to orally teach the Christians in Jerusalem that Paul carefully followed the steps of the law. So this was so that they could go around and instruct them, no, this is what Paul actually does. So first, Acts chapter 21, verse 24. Take them and purify them and pay their expenses so that they may shave your head, and that all may know that those things of which they have been informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly. And walk orderly literally means to step by the law. Over in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 6, the New King James translates this word as teach. Here it is translated as teach to emphasize what is passed on orally. Unlike general teaching, which can be oral or written, the concept of instruct here really focuses on learning from what you're actually hearing, and so therefore it is passed down verbally. And that's the focus of this particular word, which means I teach orally. So when we get into Galatians chapter 6, he's going to talk about the one who teaches us in this manner.